This podcast is made possible by our supporters on Patreon, who pledge an amount to contribute every month and in return get exclusive access to bonus content, merchandise discounts, and much more. If you'd like to join our family, please go to patreon.com/Gotham Variety and subscribe. That's Patreon/Gotham Variety.
And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of the Gotham Variety Podcast. I want to welcome all of our listeners. I thank you very much for your support and for joining me today, hoping you enjoy this latest installment of a series on boxing. But today's podcast, about one of the great lightweights ever, Barney Ross, is about more than just boxing. It's the story of a man whose life intersected with some of the 20th century's most critical events. It's also a story of resilience and courage in the face of really a lifelong obstacle course of almost unimaginable difficulties. Barney Ross, right after this.
You can follow us on Twitter @Gotham Variety, like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. We're on Spotify as well. Check out our website at gothamvariety.com, where you can send us your comments and questions. And if you love what we're doing, we'd love a 5-star review on the podcast platform of your choice. Reviews and ratings help keep our show on the charts, so more and more people can find us.
We are joined this week on Gotham Variety by a very special guest, Douglas Century, author of Barney Ross, The Life of a Jewish Fighter. Doug has authored or co-authored several New York Times bestsellers. He is a contributing editor at Tablet Magazine and writes for Billboard and the New York Times on a regular basis. Doug, it's great to have you on the show. How you doing?
Joe, thanks for having me. A pleasure to be here.
So before we dive into Barney Ross's incredibly action-packed life, I'm wondering what drew you to Ross as a subject, and also what were the challenges involved in researching a boxer who fought back in the 1930s?
Well, I went to a Yiddish elementary school. I know that sounds very strange, but in Western Canada, I went to a Yiddish elementary school, and Barney Ross had come through my hometown of Calgary, Alberta, selling Israel bonds at some point, I think in the 1960s. And my principal at the school told us about him. But there were no biographies of him. There was a As Told To autobiography that had all the facts wrong, because Barney, I don't think, even read it closely. So it was very fertile ground. And, as far as research goes, I was really fortunate to find that Barney's kid brother, George, was still alive and in an assisted living facility in Niles, Illinois, just outside Chicago. It was fun for me going through the old newsreels, because this was the heyday of great boxing writers like Damon Runyon and Grant Rice. But to actually get it from the horse's mouth, since Barney had died in the 1960s, I think the biggest challenge was just, how do you establish a fact, or how do you know what people really said? Because I'm pretty sure in a lot of the newspaper reporting back in the 30s when Barney fought, quotes were just cooked. I think reporters often just made up what they wanted the guy to say. So it was really essential that I meet somebody that knew him, and I got to know George. But yeah, the real challenge was to find someone or some connection to the man who had lived this really epic life, but was not here to talk to me.
So, born on the Lower East Side in 1909, original name Beryl Rosovsky, his father Isidore moved from Belarus to New York after barely surviving a pogrom, which, for those who don't know, is an anti-Semitic riot. Isidore worked from a pushcart, ultimately moving his family to Chicago to open a dairy store in the Maxwell Street ghetto there. Ross would later be known as the pride of the ghetto. So, Doug, talk about that environment in Chicago where Ross grew up and the sort of hard-scrabble lifestyle that was so common to first-generation Americans of really any ethnicity at that time.
Sure. Well, my parents are from Chicago. And so I was fascinated by the Jewish world of Chicago and what they often called the West Side, the old West Side of Chicago, which was the Maxwell Street ghetto. And he grew up in that era where there was a lot of Jewish poverty. There were Jewish gangsters in his neighborhood. I think very few people go into the sport of boxing unless it's out of economic necessity. There are many other ways to make a living. And the truth of the matter is, I don't think Barney had other circumstances in his life, I don't think he really would have chosen this career path. But it was a very rough environment. It was a survival of the fittest, I would call it. As it was on the Lower East Side, crowded conditions, tenements. And I think the violence, the poverty, the economic necessity was what drove Barney to become a fighter. For many of the Jewish fighters, I don't think people are aware that there were about 3,000 professional Jewish fighters in the early years of the last century. It was true for the Irish, then it became true for the Jews, and it became true for the Italians. It's always the lowest economic strata on that ladder that really wants to fight its way out of poverty. I think he loved the sport, but he boxed because he had to.
And as tough as his childhood was, I get the impression, Doug, reading your book, that Ross actually had a pretty happy childhood, all things considered. But then, December 13th, 1923, just 10 days shy of his 14th birthday, tragedy strikes. Talk about what happened that day and the impact that it had on Ross going forward.
Well, he grew up in a kind of nuclear Jewish family, and his father worked very long hours, and Barney helped out. And in the early morning hours, as you referenced, at December 13th, 1923, two guys came in and shot him dead. And Barney rushed across the street, cradled his dying father in his arms, and it was a senseless murder, and it drove Barney kind of crazy with rage. He had been raised in this Orthodox Jewish world, and he basically said, I don't believe in anything. And he ate pork, and he ran the streets. I felt like, the God that his father so, desperately wanted him to believe in and be frum, be Orthodox, didn't exist if his father could die in such a callous and cold way. And his mother actually had a nervous breakdown, we would call it today, and was sent off to live with family in Connecticut. So suddenly all these kids, Barney and his siblings, are kind of fending for themselves. And from then on, he was kind of on his own.
So the family is shattered, breadwinner gone, no safety net in 1923. So his mother's off in Connecticut, and his three younger siblings are taken into an orphanage. And as you said, Barney becomes a kind of lost soul at this point, kind of estranged from the world, rejecting religion, tattooing his initials on his forearm in defiance of Jewish law, drinking, dropping out of school, going to whorehouses, and also making the acquaintance of one Al Capone, who, like Ross, was an import from New York. Now, there have been a number of stories about Barney's involvement as a teenager with Capone. There appears to be at least something there. Were you able to separate fact from fiction and get the real story?
Well, Barney always said he worked for Capone. He was a messenger boy. And Capone and the Capone mob were front and center at a lot of his fights. I think it's quite likely that Capone sponsored Barney Ross in the Golden Gloves tournament. I don't think any of his fights were fixed, not that I can ascertain. But it really was clear that Barney, if not being mobbed up, he was certainly in the orbit of the outfit guys, the Chicago mob, who were passionate about boxing, came to all his fights. And he was the biggest fighter. By the time he was a champion, he was the biggest fighter to come out of Chicago. But, was he a mobster himself? No, he was just, as we would say, probably say connected. And the fact that they were present at his fights and in the gyms lends credence to the fact that he certainly knew Capone and Frank Nitti and all those guys were at his fights early on.
So in addition to whatever errands he's running for Capone, Ross works a variety of very low-paying jobs: usher, stockboy at Sears, a puller, finagling customers into a dry goods store, until one day at the age of 15, he steps into a boxing gym over a barber shop on the South Side. Talk about Barney's initial exposure to organized boxing. Was it purely economic, or did he enjoy it as well?
It's a big, big leap from street fighting to boxing. He's not a tall guy, and he's a slim guy. He never boxed at more than 145, 147. So picture him as a young teenager. He was probably knocking guys out in street fights, and somebody said, you ought to go box. So he comes to this gym, and there was a famous trainer named Dave Shade. And Dave Shade said to him, oh, you think you can box? And this was a famous old boxer's trick. Dave Shade was wearing a fedora, and he had a cigar in his mouth. And he said, knock the cigar out of my mouth. And with his hands behind his back. And so Barney was flailing away, throwing haymakers, and he couldn't get near the cigar because using elementary boxing defensive movement, Dave Shade was able to stay away from him. So Barney went off, and he later said and wrote in a boxing manual, I had to figure out that was the atomic secret of boxing. Throw your punch where the guy is going to be, not where he currently is. And he came back, and a few weeks later, he knocked the cigar out of Dave Shade's mouth, smashed it into his lip, I think. And they said, hey, kid, you can fight. And then he had to really learn the science of it. And for Jewish fighters, especially, the sweet science, meaning the precision of the jab. I'd read in the book about how a lot of people theorize that the boxing as we know it today kind of stems out of fencing, that stance. And so Jewish fighters were known for being especially smart, didn't want to take a lot of punches to the face. And so Barney became very, very adept at all the things that we consider the fundamentals of boxing. A really crisp jab, sense of slipping and timing and reading his opponent. He was quick. He did not have knockout power, but he distinguished himself very quickly to the point that he was able to represent Chicago in their earliest years of the Golden Gloves tournament.
So the three dominant ethnicities in boxing in the 20s were, first of all, the Irish, the Italians, and the Jews. Certainly a number of great black fighters as well, Sam Langford, Harry Wills, Latin fighters too. In fact, Ross's professional debut would be against a Mexican boxer by the name of Ramon Lugo. Unfortunately, between Jack Johnson and Joe Louis, fighters of color were blackballed from title shots. But Doug, talk about that community of Jewish boxers in the 20s. Who were the stars, and how were these men generally viewed by the Jewish community?
Well, there are so many. It's too many to name. You've got names like Ruby Goldstein and Sid Terrace and Leach Cross. But the big name is Benny Leonard. People to this day say he was the greatest lightweight of all time. So the Irish were the first group, right? We have the John L. Sullivan, all the great Irish fighters, and they kind of dominated boxing for so many years, being that they came over and there were those signs saying no Irish need apply or no Irish and dogs allowed in restaurants. So they fought out of necessity. But there was a sort of, I don't want to call it machismo, but there was a toughness to the Irish fighter. The Italians came as well, and it speaks to the aesthetic of the culture, or maybe the hard scrabble world that these different ethnicities came from. You did have Italian fighters who were popular, who would, as they say, take three punches to land one. That really tough. Jewish fight fans never wanted to see that. This is one of the things I learned from Barney's kid brother and from other experts. Jewish fight fans wanted to see a smart fighter, which meant you didn't get hit in the face. They used to say about Benny Leonard, his hair was never once messed up in the ring. He wore his hair slicked back, as did Barney Ross. And Jewish fight fans did not want to see a slugger. They didn't want to see a guy get tagged in the face a bunch of times just to land a punch. They wanted to see a guy really outbox and outthink his opponent. So this led the sports writers of the time to come up with these really, they're cliched, but they had a little truth, stereotypes that the Irish were brave and the Italians were tough, but the Jewish fighters were always clever. It speaks to the kind of irony of, the Jewish experience in America. Jews are often thought of as being intellectual and smart and all that. So even within boxing, they were stereotyped as clever fighters. Now, within the Orthodox community, any kind of sporting activity was frowned upon. So Barney's father, had he lived, would not have approved. Barney's mother was so Orthodox, she wouldn't come to his fights and she wouldn't turn on the radio. But for a Jewish boy to be a fighter was to be what they called a trumpetnik, a troublemaker, or a starker, or just a tough guy. No element of the Jewish community valued it. The communist Jews didn't value it. It's one of the reasons I think Jewish boxing has been forgotten. All these great names. I mean, Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum is probably known because he went to Hollywood, but there were dozens of legendary Jewish fighters. They were great. They were world champions. But the Jewish community itself did not value them, because it was seen that a Jewish boy should study, should become a lawyer, become a doctor. And I don't want to say that Italian kids weren't supposed to be educated or Irish kids, but I think that an Irish guy could sit around a pub and say, my son's a boxer, with great pride. Irish pubs are filled with pictures of Barney Ross. In fact, I found it really ironic that one of the few places in New York City I found a framed picture of Barney Ross was in an Irish pub. So the Jewish fighters a lot of times took Irish-sounding names because the Irish had preceded them. The most glaring example was a guy named Moishe Schnur, who fought as Mushy Callahan. So Jewish guys, a lot of the Jewish fighters took Irish-sounding names, and there actually were a few Italian fighters who took Jewish-sounding names after the Jews took over from the Irish as being the dominant ethnic group. But I think it's kind of unique in the annals of boxing history that as many great Jewish fighters as there were, and as many champions, they really were heroes of the Jewish people who actually went to the fights, but they weren't remembered by the establishment.
And he does work his way up the lightweight ranks, and after beating future Hall of Famer Billy Patrol in March of '33, he gets big press and a title shot, 2 titles actually, lightweight and junior welterweight, both held by the tough, highly unorthodox Tony Canzoneri, and Ross, Canzoneri, and Jimmy Mclaren would become the kind of holy trinity of lightweights in the early 30s, when the heavyweight division was kind of in the doldrums. Joe Louis had yet to emerge. Talk about that first title fight, Doug, in June of 1933, a 10-rounder against Canzoneri at Chicago Stadium.
Barney had made a little money fighting. He called it being a pawn shop fighter as an amateur, and maybe even his early professional fights. Pawn shop meaning he might win a pair of shoes or a watch, and he'd run to the pawn shop. But this was a big money fight for the Depression in 1933 at the Chicago Stadium. I think Barney's end of the purse would be $11,000. Barney's brother told me that Barney said Canzoneri was the greatest fighter he ever fought against. He would drop his guard and taunt you with his chin, which was something we came to see in Muhammad Ali or Roy Jones Jr. It's the cardinal sin of boxing. They say, keep your guard up. There's a reason for that. So Canzoneri fought in this highly unorthodox way, but was just a brilliant fighter. And Barney gets a shot at him in 1933, the biggest fight in years. The heavyweight division had long been dominant, but as you said, until Joe Louis came along, it was in the doldrums. Occasionally in boxing, we have these periods where the lighter weight guys, we had Sugar Ray Leonard and Roberto Duran and Hagler and Hearns. That was a great era in the 80s. This was similar. And at that first fight in 1933, it was very closely contested. It was 10 rounds. Barney won a split decision. Canzoneri's guys thought he was robbed, but Barney was the champion of the world, and it was a big event for Chicago. He won $11,000, but it was a big event for his family because, as I said, I got to know his brother George. He and his sister and the other youngest brother were in this Marks Nathan orphanage. Well, Barney had enough money, $11,000, that he got a big apartment on Independence Boulevard, got his mom set up, got his kids' siblings out of the orphanage, and sort of reunited the family. The nuclear family couldn't be rebuilt because his father was murdered, obviously, but he could do the best he could to create a new home for them through his incredible victory at that first championship fight.
And as you said, there were some hard feelings from Canzoneri's camp that he'd been robbed, that it was a hometown decision. So the rematch in September was held in New York at Barney's insistence, this time a 15-rounder, huge event. The governor was there, Babe Ruth was there, Al Jolson, plus 50,000 fans, which is kind of amazing considering how the economy was just so bottomed out. But there was another kind of sub-theme that evening. Hitler had been made dictator just before the first Canzoneri fight, and there was a huge rally in Nuremberg, Germany that got international attention just a week before the rematch, where supposed Aryan superiority was proclaimed. So that was very much in the air and on Barney's shoulders as a Jewish fighter. Actually, it was funny. I noticed on YouTube, the ring announcer, Joe Humphreys, introduces Ross as the popular American Hebrew of Chicago, which I thought was kind of amusing. But talk about the build-up to that rematch, Doug, and the fight itself, which was a visual spectacle too, with massive backdrops depicting scenes from the Hebrew Bible, right?
Just before that, they had a pageant, I guess, to counteract the horrible news out of Germany. Nobody could foresee the Holocaust, but even the fact that Hitler had come to power and there were open signs of such grotesque anti-Semitism. There was a big event, a pageant, it was called, at the Polo Grounds, and it was a pageant of the history of the Jewish people. And so some of that, the stagecraft, was still left behind, I guess, Stars of David and stuff that we would now see as being fairly commonplace, but it was unusual to see open displays of Judaism. And I think Barney, he really takes that on, that mantle. Although he was not fighting under the name Rossovsky, he changed his name to Ross. By the way, Jewish guys often change their names to keep their mothers from knowing they were fighting.
Yeah, Joe Louis, too. His mother wanted him to be a violinist. So he hid his boxing gloves in the violin case and changed his last name from Barrow to Lewis to keep it from her. Did not work.
Yeah, exactly. But here's Barney Ross. He's openly Jewish. Identifies as Jewish, is actually photographed with the Talmud and with the tallis, with Jewish prayer shawls. Yeah, and it's an amazing fight. Barney actually, as you said, insisted, I'm not going to get sullied with this reputation that I got a hometown decision. So let's fight in his hometown in New York. And Barney was a very brave fighter. He really was. He was fearless. And it was a split decision again, but almost everybody, I read Damon Runyon and all the great boxing writers said there's very little doubt that Barney got the better of him in the second fight on enemy territory. And of course, I don't think it was really an away fight for Barney Ross, because I would imagine of those 50,000 fans, there's probably half were screaming in Yiddish. The Jewish community in New York, although he was a New York fighter, he was a Chicago fighter, in this era, in the 30s, by 33, 34, 35, he really becomes the hero of the Jewish people nationwide. Yep. So, yeah, that's an epic fight. And I think Barney really cemented his national reputation. Double world champion, and he's done it in New York City in front of a huge crowd. And at that point, I think he's really, he steps onto the national stage in a much bigger way.
But here's where some behavioral issues start to emerge for Ross, who you refer to as having a bit of a compulsive personality. Around this time, he gets sort of caught up in the high life. Not the first or the last champion to do that, certainly. The temptations are considerable. But chain smoking, drinking straight vodka, incessant womanizing, but maybe the most destructive was the gambling. Talk about some of the self-created problems that developed for Barney Ross around this time that really remained with him throughout his career.
He was the sweetest guy. I did meet a lot of guys who had known him, maybe not as close as his brother, but they said, oh, Barney was the sweetest guy. Like, you couldn't believe he'd been a prize fighter because he was such a nice fellow. But yeah, he smoked and he drank. And he went to the racetrack a lot, but horse racing was a very big deal. And I think it was Al Jolson once said, "Don't sit next to me. You got such bad luck. I don't want to catch any of your poison." He once won a fight. I forget if it was like $15,000, but it was a lot of money that he blew. He just bet wrong on every single race at the racetrack. And I think he had a compulsive personality. There was an amazing photo I found for the book of him with two Ziegfeld Follies showgirls. And he was a good-looking young guy, and he had money and he had charisma. But you can't smoke and drink when you're in between fights and have longevity in his career. So, I mean, that did catch up with him. But I think he just loved being around people. I think he really was a guy that needed to be out and have that stimulus. He was certainly an extroverted guy. I met a guy a Jewish gangster, who said Barney came and spoke once at his university, of all places, and it said Barney Ross was just the greatest guy he'd ever met in his life. But on the drive out to the university, every pit stop they made, Barney had to stop at a bar and have a drink. And he got there completely plastered, but still got up and gave the best speech anyone had ever heard. So he managed to hold it pretty well. I don't think, he wasn't a violent drunk, but he did get drunk a lot, and he smoked a lot, and he hung out with a lot of women and lived his life to the fullest. That's for sure.
So I could only find 6 Ross fights on YouTube: the Billy Patrol rematch, the Canzoneri rematch, the trilogy with Mclaren, and the Armstrong fight in 1938. We'll get to that. But to me, the most compelling was the trilogy with hard-punching welterweight Jimmy Mclaren. Yet another set of fights that had ethnic overtones, this time Irish-Jewish. And Mclaren, through no real fault of his own, had a very specific reputation when it came to Jewish fighters. One of his nicknames, in addition to the Dublin Destroyer and the baby-faced assassin, was the Jew Killer. So talk about Ross's first fight with Mclaren in May of 34, held in New York just a week after a massive pro-Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden. So once again, added weight and maybe motivation on Barney's shoulders.
Yeah, well, so just to correct one thing, I mean, I've seen that written, the Jew Killer. He was actually mostly called the Jew Beater, which he hated. Jimmy Mclaren didn't have an anti-Semitic bone in his body, and he and Barney were later great friends. But of course, the press built this up as this clash between ethnicities, and he had knocked out this string of really fine Jewish fighters, including Benny Leonard had lost all his money in the Wall Street crash, and he decided very ill-advisedly to come back and try to fight again. And Jimmy Mclaren had knocked him out. So Barney said, oh my God, so now he's got to fight for the pride of the Jewish people. I found an article that actually said that Jews kind of lacked the fighting spirit. Clever fighters, as I said, but they couldn't really fight with a tough Irishman like Jimmy Mclaren. And yeah, I mean, it was astounding to me. On May 17th, 1934, 20,000 Americans gathered at Madison Square Garden for a pro-Hitler rally. That was the stage it was set. And Barney said, you know what, I'll embrace this. He wore a mezuzah. There's photos of him. They had to explain this to readers. What is a little mezuzah around his neck? And the who's who of Jewish Broadway, Al Jolson and Eddie Cantor and Fanny Brice, all came up to Grosvenor's. Barney was the first guy to kind of move his training camp into the Borscht Belt. And he kind of had a scene. It's very exciting to watch a really great fighter jump rope and shadow box and all that. But he really made it a point to say he felt like he was fighting for the honor of the Jewish people and for the reputation of the Jewish people. It wasn't Mclaren's fault that he got labeled the Jew Beater, and he always hated that nickname. But he had to wear it because he had knocked out a lot of great Jewish fighters. But this happened all within one calendar year. They fought 3 times. The first fight is they used to have an outdoor bowl called the Madison Square Garden Bowl that held 60,000 people. And anybody who was anybody, literally, everybody was there. And if you watch the 9th round, there's this incredible moment. They're really boxing, but then Mclaren tags him, I think, with a left hook, and Barney goes down to the canvas. He jumps right back up, and within 20 seconds, he knocks Mclaren down. And if you watch that 15th round, as I said, they're just kind of hanging on. There's no science anymore. They're just pummeling each other. But the decision comes down, and it's a split decision, and Barney wins. When he got back to Chicago, there was a huge ticker tape parade. The mayor and the alderman, everybody was there. His mom is in the open car riding with him. And it was really an epic event for Chicago, for Jews around the world. And Barney actually said, that fight meant so much to me. If I'd lost, I would have died.
And Ross defends his welterweight title in a rematch with Mclaren just 16 weeks later. That's typical, by the way, for the 30s, when a lot of boxers fought 2 or 3 times a week. But the rematch was a very close split decision for Mclaren, who does look sharper in that fight. He hits hard through the full 3 minutes of every round. Ross fights more in flurries, but even so, Mclaren's left eye is totally closed at the end of that fight. And 22 of the 28 writers covering the bout scored it for Ross. A lot was made of the fact that the referee and both judges were Irish, but all of this sets up the big rubber match at the Polo Grounds, refereed by Jack Dempsey, who actually does a really good job. And to me, this was the best of the 3 fights. It's also the most decisive. Still close, but Ross just looks quicker to the punch, pressing the attack, and really takes control in the last 3 rounds. Talk about the resolution of this trilogy, Doug, and also the friendship that developed between these 2 men.
It's May of 35, 45,000 fans are there. Everybody, a young boxer named Joe Louis was there. Lou Gehrig was there, and Barney really outboxes him. Again, there's not a knockout because Barney really wasn't a knockout artist. But if you talk to guys who really know fighting, I have a good friend, Mike Silver, is an expert boxer. He says the thing about Barney, he knew how to time his energy. Like he put on a flurry, the last 10 seconds of a round and steal the round. Just a really incredibly smart fighter. But in this fight, he really wanted to prove himself. He went power. He tried to, Mclaren was known for his knockout right. And I think it was Damon Runnan who wrote, in the most desperate 15-round fight between little men, Ross, the smaller guy, really outpunched the puncher. So it was a unanimous decision, this one, Jack Dempsey. Everybody said Barney had won, and he took complete ownership of that trilogy. I mean, it's a shame when you have a rubber match, but, if you win 2 out of 3, then you're seen as the guy that really was the better fighter. Mclaren was an incredible fighter. They're all Hall of Famers. I mean, Mclaren, Canzoneri, Henry Armstrong, Barney Ross, all of these guys who were lighter weight guys will go into the Hall of Fame immediately. But what's interesting is for all the, talk of anti-Semitism and the Jew beater nickname that saddled poor Jimmy Mclaren, they became really good friends. And Jimmy Mclaren was a real rarity of boxers in that he retired with a good amount of money and used to golf with Bing Crosby, and he lived well into his old age, outlived Barney by a lot. But I think it's a beautiful thing that all these guys maintain some kind of civility, if not real affection for each other, because they were warriors in the ring, but they were not mean guys outside of it.
In a perfect world, maybe Ross retires after the 3rd Mclaren fight, goes out on top like Marciano. But after that trilogy, Ross defends his title 17 times until that fateful meeting with Henry Armstrong, Homicide Hank, in May of 38. And you do see this in boxing history, great fighters in their post-prime years taking just terrible beatings from good, hungry young fighters. Larry Holmes beating up Ali, Marciano knocking out Joe Louis. That fight was actually a little more competitive. Now, unlike Ali and Louis, Ross was not knocked out by Armstrong or anyone else in his career, which is impressive for a guy who fought 79 times. But talk about that brutal scrap with future Hall of Famer Henry Armstrong.
Well, Henry Armstrong in the build-up to that fight was just a machine. I think between January of 37 and March of 38, he fought 37 times, 35 knockouts. He kind of defined that style that we had later saw in Joe Frazier, Mike Tyson, just coming forward, taking some punishment, but just hitting. Where did that energy come from? Nobody could figure it out because he was just a specimen. And he was a smaller guy. I mean, he was coming up from a much lighter weight. Barney's training, I think the fact that Barney had gone through his division so easily, he was coasting. But one of the unfortunate things is that they kind of, in some of the press said, because it had been 2 black guys that had been involved in the murder of his father, that Barney had some animus towards black fighters. That was not true at all. And he'd fought black fighters before Armstrong, but That was the ethnic buildup that they made in this fight, was that Barney had some issue with African Americans. He did not at all. That fight is often described as an utter massacre. It's actually not. For the first 3 rounds, Barney is boxing. But what happens is that you can see it in the 4th round. I said it's just like this moment, you just see his legs stop moving. His footwork just left him. And he gets pummeled. Armstrong is got his head basically against Barney's body, and he's just hitting him. A writer went through and said Armstrong threw 1,200 punches. Most of them landed clean on Barney, and his face was swelling up. His management wanted to throw in the towel. The referee came over and said, "You can't defend yourself. I'm stopping it." And Barney said to his management, "If you stop the fight, I'm never speaking to you again." He refused to quit. He wouldn't go out on his stool. He took that punishment. It looked like he was going to die in the ring at some point. But there was this enormous ovation at the end of the fight. And I think it was one of the great boxing writers, Grantland Rice, yelled, "Why didn't you, throw in the towel?" And he said, "A champ has a right to go out the way he wants." And he promised he would only take one bad beating in his career. So after that beating, he never fought again. Barney had many characteristics that made him an incredible fighter. His jab, his footwork, his ring intelligence. But he had incredible heart.
And like so many boxers before and after him, Ross kind of drifted in early retirement. His mood darkened, his marriage suffered, so shortly after Pearl Harbor, 33-year-old Barney Ross enlists in the Marine Corps. So Doug, there's 2 different versions of why he did this. The sort of conventional made-for-public consumption version and the true version, which to my knowledge, you're the first person to uncover. Talk about both versions if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, Barney felt absolutely that he had to do something for the war effort. And he could easily have done what a lot of other professional fighters did, which is Joe Louis did it. Tour the country, morale, you were in the service, but you didn't have to really go see combat. And Barney said, "Nope, I want to be in the Marines." And he said, "And I want to see action." And he goes to Camp Pendleton, and he's in the 2nd Marine Division. They say, "We've got a world champion boxer here." So for a while, he's teaching self-defense to the Marines in Camp Pendleton. I mean, who better than a former world champion boxer? He tells his CEO, "I want to see combat." Now, yes, the conventional story was always Barney was just an incredibly patriotic American and he was a born fighter. I think that's all true. But what his younger brother George told me is that Barney was so unhappy with his life and he felt lost. And he'd lost his money and he was adrift. I think he was, in a way, he wanted to go out suicidal. That's what George told me. He wrote him letters that George said, I tore them right up. I couldn't read that from my brother. I think he wanted to go to war and die a patriot. I think that was the ending he had envisioned for himself.
1942 was actually kind of a mixed year for the Allied forces. Certainly the Battle of Midway was a critical naval victory, but the surrender of the Philippines to the Japanese, that was a huge blow. And there was also that horrific and demoralizing Bataan Death March. But that summer, Guadalcanal, one of the Solomon Islands, becomes the focus, the first major land offensive by Allied forces against Japan. And Private Barney Ross is in the thick of it, hitting the beach on November 4th. And you set the scene really well in your book. Malarial mosquitoes, tropical wasps, scorpions, leeches, not to mention 36,000 crack Japanese forces. Talk about Ross's military exploits on Guadalcanal. I'm especially interested in that patrol that he volunteered for, which put him in such peril, ultimately earning him the Silver Star.
Barney landed with the 2nd Marine Division in November 1942. The 1st Marines had been taking hell. They were trying to take control of this island, Guadalcanal, so they could get an airstrip. Later writers said that the Marines who served on Guadalcanal had a kind of hardness to them because the malaria was so bad, the jungle conditions. Almost everybody who served got sick. They were living in swampy conditions. And in the middle of November of 1942, Barney is sent out on a patrol. They're ambushed by a much bigger Japanese contingent. All the guys with him are either killed or wounded. And Barney alone, using machine guns and a Garand rifle, he keeps the Japanese at bay from overrunning their position. He's smart enough, this goes back to, I guess, the way he was as a boxer. He rolls between different foxholes, is shooting different weapons, to make the Japanese think that there's more guys alive than there are. That's just him. He's the only guy who's functional. And he keeps fighting alone throughout that night. The later tally was that I think that he killed 22 Japanese, but he definitely saved the lives of the guys with him. And he was praying, going back to his Jewishness, he was praying the fundamental prayer for all Jewish men, Shema Israel, Hear O Israel. He was praying that throughout the night and calling out for his deceased father because he was sure he was going to die. But he managed to keep the Japanese at bay, and then a rescue party came, and they couldn't believe what Barney had done. It was an act of immense personal heroism and ingenuity as well. And for that, he did receive the Silver Star. I was told by many military guys that it was really, really difficult to get the Congressional Medal of Honor as a Jew. So they used to call the Silver Star the Jewish Congressional Medal of Honor. It was the highest honor Jews generally got. But this was front page news across the United States. So I think what Barney did was much like he did in his prize career. He just, as a fighter, he fought with all the creativity and all the cleverness and all the heart that he could muster. And he managed to save the lives of all the guys with him and prevented a huge enemy victory.
And so Ross is promoted to corporal, and after recovering, he's sent back to frontline action 5 more times. And around this time, he meets a man who becomes a very close friend, really till the end of his life, a Catholic Navy chaplain, Father Frederick P. Gehring. Talk about that relationship, how it developed, and if you could also describe for us a very special Christmas Eve on Guadalcanal in 1942, which it reads like something out of one of those Warner Brothers, patriotic tearjerkers of that era, but it happens to be true.
So yeah, Father Gehring was known as the Padre of Guadalcanal. And in addition to having seen so much action, that night that he was so heroic, Barney was also wounded with shrapnel. So he was in the makeshift hospital recovering from his wounds and from malaria, and he meets the Padre, both city boys, and Father Gehring says to Barney, I really followed your fight career, even though I was rooting for Mclaren in all those fights as a good Catholic. And Barney was a very skilled piano player who could play by ear. So they had a little organ, a pump organ. So they're having a makeshift Christmas midnight mass, and none of the Marines know how to play this pump organ. So it turns out it was an Orthodox Jewish guy, Barney Ross, who sits down and he figures out how to play Silent Night and all sorts of carols. And he says, look, a lot of you guys are missing your moms right now. I'm missing my mom. And if I'm going to play these Christmas songs for you, I want you to listen to a song of mine. And he goes and plays My Yiddish Mama, his famous fight entrance song. And had these hardened Marines, because it's a wistful song about there's nothing better in the world than a Jewish mother. But you don't even have to understand the Yiddish to know that it's really a song of longing. And all these guys had been through hell, 6 months of hell on Guadalcanal. They all certainly were missing their parents or missing their moms. So Barney does that. He plays My Yiddish Mama, and then he plays some beautiful Christmas carols. And as you say, it sounds like it's scripted by Hollywood, but many Marines who survived swore it was the most amazing thing they had seen. And it just speaks to, I guess, Barney's humanity. I really think he was we'd say in Yiddish, the word is a mensch, but I mean, he didn't really differentiate. His second wife was not Jewish. I don't think he really was observant in his later years as a Jewish guy, but he was very proud of his Jewishness. But yes, he would be the kind of guy that would figure out how to play Christmas carols to keep everybody else happy, as long as they would listen to My Yiddish Mama.
So after 6 months of brutal fighting, Allied forces finally prevail on Guadalcanal in February of 1943. Of course, the war still has 2.5 more years to go, but at this point, Barney's string as a Marine is pretty much played out. He has a severe malarial attack that month, becomes deathly ill with chills, hallucinations. He had dysentery, lost 30 pounds. And this is where Ross becomes acquainted with morphine. I'm sure that it was a welcome acquaintance at that time, as he wrote later, morphine lifted me out of the snake pit and let me climb high in the clouds. But here begins a 3-year look into yet another face of hell. So talk about Barney's addiction and the kind of paradoxical life he led after his discharge. Covered in accolades for his heroism, a citation from President Roosevelt at the White House, but all the while being ridden by this monkey on his back, this secret dependence on narcotics.
Yeah, so I don't know what they were thinking. I guess people didn't understand addiction, but the guys were lying there in these makeshift tents They were allowed to inject themselves when they felt pain with these syrettes of morphine. And he's now a national war hero. Ticker tape parade for him again in Chicago. And this is a really epic moment for Barney, but he really is still sneaking out. He had willing doctors for a long period of time who would sort of just give him what he needed. He became severely addicted to morphine. And ultimately, when you can't get doctors to write the prescription to heroin, he had to turn himself in to beat his addiction. And it was an enormous scandal, which we now would look at and say, well, of course, you've been through the war. You know, we understand all sorts of things, PTSD, that people didn't really seem to understand how much the body and the mind suffers. So he goes and he's arrested. It's a public scandal. And then he goes to what's called the Public Health Hospital, Lexington, Kentucky, where they helped guys get the monkey off their back. It was cold turkey. His brother George went to see him there. And I said, well, it sounded like a good hospital. And he said, it wasn't a hospital. It was an effing jail. It was basically like they took these guys who were addicted and they threw them into a locked facility. And they didn't know anything about transitioning, I guess, to lesser drugs. So they just made them beat it cold turkey. And they had hearings in the U.S. Congress in the 1950s into the problem of drug addiction and what did it mean. And Barney Ross, rather than be ashamed of it, he came forward and actually spoke on the subject. And he said that addicts should be treated like a medical problem, not a criminal problem, which is something that we're still talking about. I mean, it's an amazing thing because at that time, I guess everybody just looked at a junkie as being someone who failed in life. And Barney really testified something that we've now come to understand, that if you treat it like a medical problem and you address it, he said in his congressional testimony, yes, go after the racketeers, go after the guys who are bringing it in and selling it, but don't treat the poor guy who's shooting it in his arm as a criminal. You have to treat him as somebody who's suffering and needs medical help. But Barney sort of embraced it, even though it created an enormous scandal, embarrassed his family. They ended up making a movie of his life, and they made it all about the addiction. So rather than being remembered for these epic things that we have talked about, suddenly by the 1950s, he's just remembered as, that ex-boxer that was a junkie. And I think if it was today, it would actually be another mark of his unique, interesting, and fascinating and courageous personality.
Well, that's how I see it. And as you said, they made a movie about it called Monkey on My Back, which Ross hated. Called it Filth, Bilge, and Cheap Sensation. The poster featured the star, Cameron Mitchell, spiking his arm, but a different kind of publicity in 1963 that I'm sure was also unwelcome to a degree, when it turns out that Barney Ross was a lifelong friend of none other than Jack Ruby. Ruby, of course, shot Lee Harvey Oswald on national TV just 2 days after Oswald shot JFK, but that's a friendship that went back to Chicago when Ross and Ruby were kids. So oddly enough, the name Barney Ross is referenced a number of times in the Warren Commission report, and he was interviewed by the FBI. Talk about that surreal chain of events after JFK's assassination.
Jack Ruby was at every one of Barney Ross's fights. He even came to the fights in New York. They were good friends. He was called Sparky because he was so hot-tempered. Barney Ross was the polar opposite. He had rage. He had controlled rage in the ring, but he hardly ever lost his temper outside it. Unless he heard something anti-Semitic, he might get angry. But he really was a very mild-mannered guy. By the time Jack Ruby goes off to Dallas, I don't think Barney's really in his life anymore. But Jack Ruby goes off and is suddenly in the headlines again as the killer of Oswald, and conspiracy theories that he's part of the Chicago outfit, the mafia, sent to silence Oswald. Well, they interview Barney Ross, and Barney basically says, well, yeah, that's my childhood friend, and there's no way that the guys, the boys, they would call him, there's no way the boys would ever use him because he's too hard to control. He has too bad a temper. There's no way he could have been a working assassin for the mob guys in Chicago because nobody could control him ever. He wouldn't follow orders.
Also, I've always thought that the mob would have zero motivation to kill the president. I mean, actually, every motivation not to. They had a long tradition of not killing cops and politicians because of the heat that comes with that, not to mention the fact that Bobby was still there, and really, he was their chief nemesis.
Exactly. But again, so Barney's family says, his younger brother George, when he was still alive, said, we were still kind of reeling as a family from the fact that he'd been made into this junkie figure, and next thing he's defending Jack Ruby of all people. Barney was cut from that cloth. A friend was a friend was a friend. And he often said that. I wasn't going to turn my back on, Jack Ruby probably didn't have a friend in the world at that moment when he was on trial for murder. But Barney was called as a witness. And he not only gave Warren Commission testimony, he came to the trial and testified on Jack Ruby's behalf as much as you could. But it was a different world. You came from the west side of Chicago. It was like coming from the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The west side of Chicago were these tough, lifelong friends. And so when he saw his friend who had been at all his fights in trouble, Barney said, hey, I'll come down and I'll do you a solid and I'll give you some testimony on your behalf. Of course, it didn't help Jack Ruby at all. But, if your friend does something really horrible and he was your friend, maybe you've still got to have his back and say whatever you can about him. But I think it really is an interesting thing that his defense of Jack Ruby was, no, Jack Ruby was far too crazy for the mob to ever use him as a hitman. Yeah. That was literally what he told the FBI.
Now, unlike his idol, Benny Leonard, who died in the ring of a massive heart attack while refereeing a fight at St. Nick's Arena in 1947, Ross's death 20 years later of cancer was slow and excruciating, but he endured it with typical bravery, and he chose to die at home on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. So, final question, Doug. In a time when so many lack historical knowledge and context, it saddens me that guys like Barney Ross and so many other great boxers who fought before the explosion of mass media, they seem to kind of get lost in the shuffle. So I wonder if you could sum up the importance of Barney Ross's place in history.
After I wrote this book, it was amazing to me. We had an event in Chicago, and everybody in Chicago of a certain age knew Barney Ross, and he was so beloved. But guys also came up to me, men in their 60s, and said, I went to high school in the Bronx, and Barney Ross came and talked to my high school about the perils of drug addiction. And he didn't give us a lecture like, you shouldn't do this. He said, look, I've been on that junk. And let me tell you, and he really taught. So, and nobody was paying him to do this, by the way. Yes, Barney missed the TV age by a little bit. The boxers of the 50s, you had the Gillette Friday Night at the Fights. Those guys are remembered better. Now, had Barney Ross had a Jake LaMotta life, I think Jake LaMotta was a lot more troubled. A lot of people said to me, Jake LaMotta was a guy that you didn't want to see in a bar. But he had a Martin Scorsese take him on and rebuild his life. So everybody knows the Raging Bull. Is Barney Ross, in the annals of boxing, a better boxer than Jake LaMotta? Absolutely. He may not rank in the top 10 of welterweights, but most people who know boxing count him in their top echelon, in the lighter weight divisions. Now, is he remembered by the right people? Yes. Do boxing historians know who he was? Absolutely. Do military historians know what it meant to fight in the Battle of Guadalcanal and distinguish yourself and get the Silver Star? Absolutely. But I think that, Jake LaMotta's career was really remembered not for his epic fights, which were great against Sugar Ray Robinson, but LaMotta really was remembered because of that movie. And it was an incredible, one of the greatest boxing movies ever, if not the greatest. Barney Ross's movie was about his drug addiction. He deserved a better fate than Monkey on My Back. But I think I show Barney Ross's fight films to real fight experts, and they say, now that's a master boxer. Look at how calm he is. Look at the precision of his fighting. And at no point does he lose his cool. I think he should be remembered with all the greats of boxing. He should also be studied in schools as really a guy who was truly an embodiment of the word hero. He was a hero in the ring. He was a hero to the Jewish people for embracing his Jewishness at a time of Nazism. He was a hero to the United States by enlisting and fighting with great distinction. And he was a hero to society by stepping forward and talking about his addiction. I think that physical courage is something that is easily understood, and Barney embodied physical courage. But moral courage is more complex, and Barney also embodied that. He did not at any point in his life back down from a fight. He was always fighting. And that moment when you said he was dying slowly of cancer, the one thing I took away that wasn't sad was that there were these huge benefits in Chicago and in New York where the boxing world came out. And these were the world champions, Muhammad Ali, everybody came. One thing about Mike Tyson, he gets a bad rap for some of his behavior, but he knew the fight films. And I had seen him once saying, I am but a shadow of a guy like Barney Ross. So I asked Bert Sugar, how would Mike Tyson even know Barney Ross? He said, well, because his trainers had all the old fight films. And a fighter knows what he's seeing. Mike Tyson knew what he was seeing in the ring there. So is he remembered by history? I think he will be. ultimately, and I think he should be remembered as the ultimate fighter and as a man of great physical as well as moral courage.
That's well said. The book is called Barney Ross, The Life of a Jewish Fighter. Pick it up. It's a well-researched, compact, beautifully written book about an incredible fighter both in and out of the ring, with tons of anecdotes and detail that we could not cover today. Doug, great work here. Thanks so much for being part of the show. I really appreciate it.
Well, Joe, it was a real pleasure being on, and I hope your listeners will read more about Barney Ross, or at least remember that name, because he's deserving of a place in our history. Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. All right, we'll come back. More Gotham Variety in just a moment.
Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Gotham Variety, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, joe@gothamvariety.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and get exclusive access to bonus content, please go to patreon.com/GothamVariety and subscribe.
And that'll do it for this week's episode of Gotham Variety. Don't forget to check us out and subscribe on Apple, Stitcher, or Spotify so you don't miss a single episode. We continue our study of world champion boxers on our next podcast with George Foreman, then Rocky Marciano after that. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care, and I'll see you soon.